Portland Trailblazers looked like they were finally ready to commit to a rebuild. Traded away Norman Powell and Robert Covington, then moved on from CJ McCollum and Larry Nance Jr. But the trade return was not great, especially for the Norman Powell-Robert Covington trade, and even still for the CJ McCollum trade, although you can argue it wasn't a terrible return given his value. And also, Jusuf Nurkic and Damian Lillard were not traded, even though Jusuf Nurkic is an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year, and Damian Lillard would give them the most assets of high value if they wanted to go in to a complete rebuild. So let's talk about why the Portland Trailblazers deadline moves were confusing. Let's talk about why the moves were made, but why now, based on the moves that have been made, might only make sense for the Trailblazers to move on from Damian Lillard and move on to another era. The Portland Trailblazers trade deadline summary is as followed. Leaving the team, Norman Powell, who was just acquired only a year ago for Gary Trent Jr., who was a very good improving young player in the league, who we'll talk about a little bit more later. Robert Covington, who was acquired for 2 first-round picks nearly 2 years ago. CJ McCollum, who has been the long-time running mate in the backcourt to Damian Lillard. Larry Nance Jr., who was just acquired this past summer. And Tony Snell. Heading the way of the Portland Trailblazers, Eric Bledsoe, who will likely not be on the team past this year if he even plays this year. Josh Hart, who's probably the most valuable player and the only valuable player the Portland Trailblazers have gotten back. For players, they have also received Didi Lazuda. Joe Ingles, who will not play a game for them as he's a unrestricted free agent at the end of the year. Likely won't resign and is out for the rest of the year. Depth forward Justice Winslow. Young but not overly hopeful young prospect Keon Johnson. Elijah Hughes, who's a second-round pick 3 years ago, who hasn't played that much. And that's it. After that, they got the 2025 second-round pick, 2026, 2027, and 2022 second-round pick from 3 different trades, and a first-round pick from the Pelicans. That's it. That's a lot of pieces in volume, but essentially, they traded away Norman Powell, Robert Covington, CJ McCollum, Larry Nance Jr., and Tony Snell for 4 second-round picks, only one of which is before 2025, 1 first-round pick, and Josh Hart. That's it. That is it. Norman Powell, Robert Covington, CJ McCollum, Larry Nance Jr., and Tony Snell. And that is all they got back. Norman Powell was traded for Gary Trent Jr., who would be great in a rebuild right now. Robert Covington was traded away for 2 first-round picks. Young assets that could have been and could have been acquired that would have helped a rebuild. Instead, they tried to prolong things. They tried to fix the era of Portland Trailblazers basketball with Damian Lillard. And a year later, after the Norman Powell trade, they decided to blow it up. But not fully. And that's the confusing part. Essentially, the Trailblazers get a bunch of seconds, 1 valuable pick, and Josh Hart. We love second-round picks. They're great. Said no one ever. I don't understand the logic from Portland. They decided to trade away 4 of their best 7 players, but kept their all-star NBA caliber guard, who has led them for the past decade, alongside Jusuf Nurkic, which is slightly less confusing. But still, if you're going to trade all the vets, why is Jusuf Nurkic still there, considering he's an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year? Doesn't really make sense. In short, they traded away key veterans around Dame for picks. And not great picks, just picks. A pick of value, if you want to think about it that way and remove the plural. And then a bunch of seconds, which sure, maybe you're going to hit someone great. Not likely. There aren't that many elite second-round pick talents kicking around that are going to alter the value of your franchise. At the same time, they held on to rising star Anfernee Simons, who plays the same position as Dame, has been absolutely brilliant while Dame has been out of the lineup, and has been showing that he's kind of ready to take over. He ain't ready to go back to the bench. And as much as they've done the Dame CJ thing for a long time now, Dame and Anfernee Simons offensively is even worse than Dame and CJ. Offensively, that'd be amazing. But defensively, I don't think that even as good as offensively as they are, there's no way they could get enough pieces around them for that defense to be anywhere near enough as adequate. So instead, they sit in the worst place to be in the NBA. No man's land. Mediocrity. But even more so than they were before. Before, they were in a mediocrity of we are consistently a lock to get into the playoffs, but we lose in the first round more often than we don't. Which isn't a great spot in mediocrity to be, but it's better than the spot in mediocrity where you still have an all-NBA caliber player on your team that can lead you to be a competitive team that still pushes you in and around the play-in tournament spots, but you're never going to be bad enough to truly tank, to truly acquire those top 5, top 6 picks in the draft that are really franchise-altering, franchise-changing picks more often than not that allow you to start to truly rebuild towards being something more than just a play-in team and a borderline play-in team. That's something that I'm going to be mentioning about in the Kings in a future video. The Kings have had a similar problem where they've never truly tanked to get consistent top-end picks. And it's been a problem for them alongside many other problems, but it has been a problem. And Portland have put themselves in that situation now as well, where with Dame in town, they're never going to be able to rebuild, but they traded away all of their veterans so that they've taken a bit of a step back, but not enough of a step back for them to suck and truly start to rebuild. And it's not like they even traded anyone away to really open up minutes to Anfernee Simons. Sure, they did trade away Norm, they did trade away CJ, but ultimately, you didn't have to move both of those guys to give Anfernee Simons minutes. One of them was already playing at the 3 anyways. You just signed Norm, which also just makes it that much more confusing, considering you just traded him away for Gary Trent a year ago. And you also traded away Robert Covington, which, given he's an unrestricted free agent at the end of the year, makes sense. But in combination, none of these moves make sense. None of them help an end goal for the Trailblazers that is any bit successful or productive long term. Staying in mediocrity is the worst thing you can do as an NBA franchise. And if you don't have the assets to move to potentially get out of it, which the Trailblazers now don't after trading away the majority of their veteran players, then it's best to commit to a rebuild. The Trailblazers can continue to be a good team, but the only way they were going to make the push towards being a contender was if they packaged players like Norm, like CJ, with Anfernee Simons and tried to acquire an equal or better player than Damian Lillard. That was the only way it was going to happen, because Damian Lillard is simply not good enough to lead you to a title. I know that might upset some Portland Trailblazers fans or Damian Lillard fans, but that's just the reality of it. Damian Lillard has been at the forefront of the Trailblazers for a long time now. And sure, you can argue some of the pieces around him have not been great, but Dame would have to have the absolutely perfect roster assembled around him while he is the best player for the Trailblazers to be a title contender. And that just doesn't happen in the NBA. You don't get the perfect assembly of pieces. It just doesn't exist. Dame would need like a #1 defense with really good role players and 3-and-D wings. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Dame is great, but there are a very select number of people in the NBA that can lead a team as a #1 guy without an equal to an NBA title. And Dame's not that. And they don't have the assets anymore to acquire someone around him at that level. And so it's time to rebuild. It's time to move from Dame, and it's time to give Portland a chance to have that type of upside where you can have that title contending team. And I know it's hard, especially as a small market team, trade away a star player who has committed himself to the team in the city, and Dame has committed himself fully, and I respect him for that. But I understand and can appreciate how hard it is, but also how good and beneficial it can be to make that move for the good of the franchise. I'm a Toronto Raptors fan. And when DeMar was traded, it was tough initially. DeMar's one of my favorite players of all time. And he committed himself to the organization, to the city. And he was the first all-star caliber player to do that in Toronto. To stay past his rookie deal and his first rookie extension, to commit himself and to openly express for years and years and just visibly see how much he loved the Raptors and the city of Toronto. But ultimately, the Raptors were better off in the end trading him. We won a title, and we've continued to be a very good team without him. Similar things lie in Portland, but in the opposite direction. Portland are not going to be winning a title by trading away Dame, but Portland can start to get to a new era of Portland Trailblazers basketball. An era where they're not just going to be a first-round exit every year, and they actually can start to build some upside again towards being a top-tier contender. And it's so much easier now that Anfernee Simons has taken the step up over the last few months. They have their next Damian Lillard. He might not be at the same caliber, but this is a guy who has all-star potential. He knows how to score the basketball. He knows how to shoot. He's going to be a very good starting point guard for the Portland Trailblazers for a long time to come. The young assets they will get player-wise and pick-wise from trading away Damian Lillard alongside Anfernee Simons, alongside Nasir Little, alongside whoever else they acquire over the next couple of years, is going to be a very, very nice springboard that most teams don't get when starting a rebuild. You just don't. Orlando started a rebuild this year. They had Nikola Vucevic and Aaron Gordon to trade away, and they got nice assets. But most teams don't got a Damian Lillard. Heck, Detroit had an aging and underperforming Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond, who were arguably negative assets, and they started a rebuild. Portland have the opportunity to have a really good rebuild and actually acquire some young stars via the draft that can give them more upside than they currently have with this Damian Lillard group. I know some people have made the argument that Portland are just making cap space to add alongside Damian Lillard. That is their plan. That's how they're going to add to this group and make them a contender. But I have doubts with that. Again, no disrespect to Portland, but I understand small market orientation in free agency. I'm a Raptors fan. We don't get big names in free agency. Our biggest free agency signing, Damari Carroll, and that was a flop. I understand that. And we're Toronto. Arguably a bigger market than Portland, even although the argument is we're not in the US. But Portland's not a big free agency destination. If anyone is attracted there, it's not going to be a co-star to fit along Dame, which is what Portland needs to contend. If they fit a bunch of good role players around Dame, sure, that's fine. But then Portland are just exactly back where they were for the last 4 or 5 years. They're just going to continue to be a fine team that loses in the first round. And that's fine for some organizations. If Sacramento could do that right now, that's great. It'd be amazing for Sacramento to get a series of playoff basketball right now. But when you've been doing that with the same nucleus of Damian Lillard for 6, 7, 8 years, eventually it's time to change. It's time to try and change things up and move some opportunities around so that you can have that higher echelon of hope, of upside, and a young star that can potentially lead something different in Portland. And they already have one of those pieces and one of the top end pieces in Anfernee Simons. They just need to add someone alongside him who's an equal or a greater piece to lead the next era. The Trailblazers organization have had a great run with Dame. The best of the organization since the early 2000s. But the peak of Damian Lillard has come to an end. And although being a first round pick is great for many teams, or a first round loss, I should say, is great for many teams, after doing it for so many years, being led by the same star, eventually you have to recognize it's time to move on. It's time to rebuild. It's time to get future assets via players, via draft picks. What you're all going to get for Dame, you're going to get multiple firsts and a solid young player, alongside Anfernee Simons, alongside whoever else you will then draft with your own and others' firsts. It's time to build around Anfernee Simons and these future assets. Try and build the next exciting future of the Trailblazers that hopefully has a higher ceiling and a chance to be an NBA title contender.